Welcome back to the Health Revival Show. We are here today with another interview for you with Dr. Elizabeth Wanek, who has a product that I'm really excited to talk about because it's different than a lot of products out there, but it has similar ingredients. So we want to kind of talk through that. But before we dive into that, we're going to talk all things cell health, cellular medicine. That is our jam here on the Health Revival Show. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Wanek. We're so excited. Wanek,
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
short name.
Wanek. Thank you. Very happy to be here. Yes.
Perfect. I have a last name that's 14 letters. So I give myself, I'm so bad with last names. Everyone line up. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this and how you got into cellular health
Yeah,
and now
certainly. Um,
product you guys offer?
yeah, I have an undergraduate degree in chemistry. And from there, I went on to medical school. And one of the most favorite things that I found in medical school was surgery. I was in a special, it was called an honors course in surgery, and where we got to do hands-on laboratory work and doing different operations on dogs. And I was fascinated by that. So I went on to get a residency training in general surgery and then moved on and got a fellowship training in pediatric liver transplantation, and then another fellowship year in pediatric surgery, and was in the practice of pediatric surgery for almost 9 years. And at the time, I was studying for my surgical boards, which was about 25 years ago now. I was introduced to something called the Zone, and it was a book written by a PhD biochemist by the name of Barry Sears. Some of your audience, or maybe even you, may be aware of it.
Serious?
And I started reading the book at the same time I was studying for my surgical boards. And this book is more or less nutritional biochemistry, which I thought only pertained to helping patients who couldn't eat, who are on IVs, or about weaning patients from ventilators. But then I was intrigued because this sounds like something that could be applicable to my life, which I never really totally understood. But I changed the way I was eating and eating what I call biochemically, which is delivering nutrients into the body the way it's designed to stabilize blood sugar and create something called euglycemia. And I felt immediately better. Before all this, I was just pretty much eating the way I was told, which was a lot of salads, exercise, and you'll be fine. Well, I was tired a lot. I was hungry all the time. I was doing what I would consider would be CrossFit, playing racquetball, riding 2 miles on a bike on Saturdays, lifting weights every day. I was tired and hungry all the time. And when I started eating biochemically, I was actually eating much less and feeling better. And so that really led me to a fork in the road where I changed paths from pediatric surgery into what is called functional medicine. In 1998, that's when the first class was held in Gig Harbor, Washington, by someone named Jeff Bland, who again, many of your audience may know, or even it seems like either both of you know about. Jeff Bland at the time was doing something called nutritional medicine updates, and then he developed a course in nutritional and functional medicine.
All right, if you're dealing with water retention, you're waking up puffy, your ankles or your wrists are really swollen, or you can't get your rings off, and maybe you're even dragging throughout the day, no matter how much water you drink, there's actually a good chance that you're not actually hydrating properly.
Exactly, because water alone is not enough. You need electrolytes, you need sodium, potassium, magnesium, because those things actually pull water into your cells. Otherwise, you're basically just flushing it out and wondering why you're still tired, you're still bloated, and you're still sluggish.
But here's the thing, most electrolyte supplements out there aren't helping you in any way because a lot of them contain things like natural flavors, food dyes, and maltodextrin, which can irritate your gut. And these things can also spike your blood sugar when you're trying to heal.
That's why we both started using Buoy. It's super simple, just trace minerals and electrolytes in liquid form. No flavors, no colors, no sugar, no sweeteners, and you squeeze it into whatever you are drinking. Water, coffee, tea, smoothies, you name it.
And it's clinically backed by science too. So studies have shown that buoy helps you hydrate better, 64% better in fact, and that's data coming from key blood and urinary markers, not just marketing fluff. And honestly, you can feel the difference. I've had many clients tell me their digestion's improved, they have less headaches, and they're better energy throughout the day.
And buoy isn't just for people that go to the gym all the time and sweat a bunch. They actually offer a 35% lifetime discount for anyone that's struggling with chronic illnesses. Things like POTS, Hashimoto's, Crohn's disease, chronic migraines, and every autoimmune condition. They're really committed to making better hydration accessible to people who need it most.
I actually throw it in my coffee every morning because it's such an easy upgrade. You don't even taste it, but you're definitely gonna notice if you miss it.
If you're tired of playing hydration roulette and want something that actually supports your body, you've gotta try buoy. It's honestly one of the simplest ways to feel better faster.
And I was the first class, 1998, which was 4 long weekends. I got training in functional medicine and then continued to study and learn that. But at the same time, I was teaching my patients um, in my now consultative practice about biochemical eating and how that can be used as a fundamental process or fundamental practice to supporting health. And I was noticing significant changes at that time. This was in the early 2000s. People were more focused, they had less fatigue, they just had fewer cravings, they were losing weight, their body composition was improving. But as I continued to study and learn, I was introduced to a Chinese medicine practitioner who told me about something called fulvic acids, which I had never heard about before, didn't know what they were. Um, and yet I was intrigued by it. I was introduced to a agroecologist by the name of Dr. Robert Faust, who had been studying soil and its ecology and its action for, at that time, probably 20 years. He was what I call the original regenerative agriculture practitioner. He grew up in the Amish country in Pennsylvania and watched the Amish and how they renewed the land. And I basically spent quite a bit of time speaking with him, and I was going to start taking fulvic acids myself. But at the same time, a patient presented to me with intractable ulcerative colitis. He was having 8 to 10 bloody bowel movements a day. He was losing weight. He was on steroid enemas. He was on immunosuppressive agents, and he wasn't getting better. But I already knew from my study of fulvic acids that the Chinese had been using this for years as rectal irrigation for ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel disease. Well, I wasn't going to do the rectal irrigations, but I asked him to start taking the fulvic acid by mouth. And within 2 weeks, no more bloody bowel movements. He was eating again and he was having normal bowel movements. And that was at the time almost miraculous to me because I had never had any kind of experience like this. And so that allowed me or stimulated me to learn more about this. I continued to learn with Dr. Faust and then incorporated fulvic acids into my medical practice. And as I learned more, I continued to kind of wonder about inflammation. What is this? Because in functional medicine, it was always taught that inflammation is the cause of disease. But that didn't really totally sit with me because, well, what causes inflammation? So then I kind of brought that together with what I was learning about fulvic acids, which are organic acids made of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen that interface with fundamental processes that are happening in the cells, the body, all the time. And that's to take nutrients in, reduce these nutrients to atoms that the cells are then going to use, at the same time, regulate pH, potential hydrogen. Everything in the body runs around chemical reactions that are always bringing back pH to neutral. And that's when I started thinking about, well, what is controlling all these processes? What is behind all of this? And functionally, the human body is a machine, if you will. That's the best analogy I can give. that's running chemical reactions and burning fossil fuel. I mean, the primary fuel that's burned in the body is glucose, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And its delivery into I'll back up. Glucose is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Doesn't have any nitrogen in it. But to back up, every system in the body runs based on a blood sugar that's just right, not too high and not too low. And that's called euglycemia. And when calories are burned, heat is generated. Well, what is heat? It's flames. So the root cause of inflammation is burning calories. And not just burning calories when food is ingested, but burning calories when that food is being processed to be reduced to atoms to then make new cells or make things happen in the cells to make DNA, to make RNA, to make ribosomes, to make endoplasmic reticulum, to make new mitochondria. I mean, the cell processes require energy, which creates heat. And heat is the source of inflammation. That's what inflammation means, in flames. So,
Mhm.
so, so keeping the body regulated and making the least heat makes it most efficient. And that's where we come back to the biochemistry of food, the biochemistry of nutrition, and it's effectively insulin and glucagon balance that's controlling not just how food calories are ultimately going to be made into glucose or structural amino acids or structural fatty acids, but also the signaling messages that are telling and coordinating how all the cells are going to work together. And so we have an inflammatory side of our body, which is doing things and burning calories and generating heat. And we have an anti inflammatory side of our body, which is water. Water is what's in our body to contain the heat. And fundamentally, burning calories requires water and it's actually drying the body out. So we have to find a balance in everything. Is this making sense as I'm telling you about this?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we
Mm, Water has to be in an optimal form, which means uh, in a form that has energy itself. And the energy that water contains is different from the energy that people talk about that's being created when phosphorus is put onto an adenine molecule in the mitochondria. So there's a driving force, there's a power that's running the body, and ultimately it's coming from the sun. It's not just the sun's light, but it's also the light that we're making within us. So every time a a nerve ending fires, or every time there's an action within the cell itself, or within the nucleus of the cell, or within the mitochondria, there's actually light created. Chemical reactions create light. So the power source that runs us is light. It's either the light we're generating within or the light that comes from the sun. And the light that comes from the sun or within us is translated into power by the pigments in our cells called melanosomes. And these melanosomes are found not just in the skin, but surrounding the nucleus of every cell. And melanosomes, the pigments in the melanosomes, are able to take light energy and convert it to chemical energy into water. And then water acts as the battery of the body and turns chemical energy into electricity. And this electricity is then what is activating the enzyme systems, which are the motors in our body that are, call them the manufacturing plants, that are the things that are doing things. I mean, they're literally motors that are rotating. And part of also what I didn't quite fully understand was that when we're introduced to the concept of enzymes in medical school in cell biology, it's like, well, what are enzymes? They're catalysts and they reduce the activation energy so that reactions that would otherwise take years to happen can happen in nanoseconds. Well, where does that activation energy actually come from? And it's coming from the hydroelectric power that's generated by water. And ATP wouldn't even release the energy that's stored in that chemical bond without it being hydrolyzed. It's water that has to break the bond of that third phosphate to release what's called Gibbs free energy that functions as an energy coupling agent. And that does then support the flow of the systems that are required to take nutrients in, break them apart, and then put them back together again, and then get rid of the waste that's produced in all of that. And if we don't have an efficient system, then the system is going to break apart. As I tell my patients, we've got several things going on. We have to take in nutrients. We know this. We have to take in proteins and carbohydrates and fats so that we have the raw materials to make new cells, red cells, white cells, liver cells, platelets, etc. Without a supply of raw materials to make new cells, we wouldn't be sitting here today talking with each other because we would have long outstripped the number of cells that we had when we were born to sustain us. So, first of all, the nutrients that we take in are required to make new cells. But in that process, as an example, spinach doesn't look like a liver cell. So, we have to take the spinach and break it completely apart into nutrient elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, magnesium, iron, whatever it is. And then the intelligence of the body, of the cells, puts these things back together again, but in the process makes garbage. And so we have to have the ability to break the nutrients apart, put them back together again, and get rid of the garbage. And if that isn't being done effectively and efficiently, what we're doing, like in any system, and just think about, if you get busy in your own life and, I'll just deal with that later. I'll just put the garbage in the closet and I'll come back to it later. And the cell tries to do that too. And this garbage is metabolic waste that is acidic. And when this acidic waste builds up, then it effectively changes the fundamental need in the cell to have pH balance. So when the cell environment becomes more acidic, it cannot function. It's a breaking of the rules in the first place that create the dis-ease and ultimately the ability of the body to maintain itself. And it really starts with maintaining balance. Fundamentally, dis-ease starts with a loss of power. So where does the loss of power come from? It comes firstly from dehydration. And we could spend a whole hour on this subject alone or more. I could talk about this forever. But the loss of power comes from not having enough water in the cells that's translating the power source, the light, into electrical energy. And then the confounding thing here is because we're made of fossil fuel, and this is an understanding that comes out of Chinese medicine. So there's basic elements: earth, air, fire, water, and metal. And so the wood element is the organic matter. And when organic matter is burned, then it dries out. And once that enzyme system, once the motors that are running this whole system become dried out, it's very difficult to get the water back in it. I give this example. If we take mud which is water and nutrient elements, soil and minerals and silicone and calcium carbonate and other things. We take mud and we fire it in a clay oven and turn it into a brick. That's organic matter that's now hardened. And how easy is it to get that brick turned back into mud? It takes years and years and years of processing of rain and wind and sun and freezing, etc., to turn that mud back into turn the brick back into mud. And so, gradually this understanding is that there's just things that are operational at a level that I never learned in medical school and that I never learned even in functional medicine because I went on beyond that into what's actually driving the cell, and what's driving the cell is having all these systems in place and working in balance and knowing that it's heat that ultimately is degrading the function, and dryness is what prevents an action, because we have to have water in the cells and we have to have electricity in the cells to make all of this work.
Amazing. I love the analogies and breakdown, for people to kind of help visualize that. And it's just so funny as we were sitting here, I'm just shaking my head thinking like what my doctors used to tell me when I was struggling with brain fog and joint pain and fatigue and constipation and bloating and skin
Right.
issues. And they just told me calories in, calories out. Right.
Right.
And this is so much more complex, as you're saying, right? Like food is the fuel, but it also has to be turned and converted into energy. And, many people we know
Right.
do not hydrate themselves properly. We talk about hydration all the time on this podcast and minerals and all of that. So I would love to hear from you on that side. How do you counsel your patients on water? Because there's two huge things foundationally that I'm talking with a lot of my clients about: water quality and air quality.
Right.
And we get into these conversations around the filtration. I always tell people if you can't get a high quality water filter, then you need to move to distilled water and then remineralize it. If you are somebody who thinks that your filter in your fridge is doing anything, the truth is it's not. So I would love to know, like, how do you counsel your patients on that in terms of mineral status? Are they adding the fulvic acid and they're adding different electrolytes, sodium, potassium, magnesium? What type of
Right.
filtration do you recommend? Those types of things.
Right. So fundamentally, we have to look at nature and what nature does to support this, because human beings are part of the natural process. We're not separate from it. But what did happen along the way is that we no longer live in the high Himalayas. We don't live in the Okefenokee swamp. We
Mm,
don't live in the highlands of Scotland or in the highlands of Michigan, where we could just walk out in our backyard into a clean stream that is loaded with fulvic substances that came out of healthy soil.
mm,
So water has to be processed to remove contaminants, remove chlorinated substances, and to remove heavy metals and other volatile organic chemicals, etc. But in doing so, the life of the water has actually been removed as well. So effectively, whether it's filtered water, whether it's RO water, whether it's distilled water, the speed and the life of the water molecule has been depleted. So the way I counsel my patients is, and this is based on studies that were done by Victor Schauberger, who was a Austrian naturalist. That's his, the moniker he was given, but he actually grew up in the Austrian Bavarian Alps and watched water and watched how it worked. And water had to have a centripetal motion to have its action. So what I counsel patients relative to water is to add the centripetal motion back to the water. Processing the water with multi-stage filtration or distillation or RO is fine, but you have to add the life back to the water, because it's water that has centripetal flow or something called vortex force that is able to maintain the elements in water that have to be there to be carried to the cells. If the cells aren't receiving the nutrients they can't do the work. And the human body is designed to deliver nutrient elements in vortex flow. And this was also demonstrated hundreds of years ago by a man named Rudolf Steiner, who saw that the heart was not a pump, but that it was an amplification of vortex flow, and that the arteries had their own inertia and their own momentum, and they were actually twisting. And if you look on a Doppler ultrasound, that's what you see. You see flow coming to and away from the probe. And that's because the water is actually the blood is moving in a vortex action, which when you're looking at it on cross section, it's moving away and toward the probe. And so it's supporting vortex flow in the water elements of our body. That's important. Yes, processing water to eliminate the toxins is important, but you have to restore the natural life to the water, and that's done through vortexing of the water. Whether you do it in a carafe on the counter or you use a plumbing piece, and people, if they're interested, can go to my website and learn more about this. Restore the vortex flow. Vortex flow is non-local, and after you've vortexed the water, then drink it. This flow pattern goes to your whole body. It sustains and supports vortex flow in your whole body. And it's a difference between having a meandering stream generating electrical power and a thundering rapids generating electrical power in your body. So an example, for instance, dis-ease, as I said, is a loss of power. Well, what happens in the blood if there's a loss of power? Whatever's in the blood loses its ability to stay there, and it starts it's called precipitating out of solution or falling out of solution, and then it's sticking to the arteries as something called biofilm. People use the word biofilm. What is that? It's dead organic matter that is no longer communicating or functioning within the system. And it comes from a loss of power, which is either the blood element not having the power or the blood being the wrong pH. And the wrong pH can be set up by eating foods that are either too alkaline or too acidic, or a loss of water power. And I don't recommend putting salts back into the water, because in a system that's an electrical system, adding salts beyond what nature is providing in the food that's being eaten allows corrosion. Salts corrode the cells of our body. So the analogy I give is, what happens, your car is working fine until one day you go and you hear that, just that clicking sound that it doesn't start, and you open the hood and you see corrosion all over the anodes and the anode of the battery. Your battery doesn't work because it's corroded with salts, and that's the same thing that happens in the body. So I don't recommend adding minerals to water. Reverse osmosis obviously demineralizes water, or distillation demineralizes the water, but it's really the best to allow nature to bring the minerals in the food that you're eating, not to artificially manipulate it, because that can add to the corrosion of the body. It's a very delicate balance that has to be maintained, not with just sodium and not with just magnesium and not with just calcium, but the other nutrient elements: potassium, silicone, carbon, manganese, zinc, iodine, chlorine, phosphorus, sulfur, etc. And when that balance is upset by artificial manipulation, then the body has to try to adjust, but more salt is actually created in the body. So the plaque that we see, whether it's in the arteries, whether it's the gallstones, whether it's the plaque in the nerve conduction system of the heart associated with atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter, or whether it's the plaque, the amyloid plaque that we see in the brain, this is all associated with a loss of power and a complex salt formation within the cells. And when that complex salt has been produced by the cell, it's the brick. The brick has been created, and it's very difficult to get that brick back into mud. So I recommend vortex water, whatever water a person wants to drink, just vortex that water before you drink it. Add the power back to the water because it's the power of water that's sustaining us. And processed water has lost its power.
So obviously they can learn a lot more about this on your website. We'll link that out in the show notes so they can go and look at how they can do that, like you mentioned.
Yeah, there's much more information, and we also have a YouTube channel, and it's a Life, ITSAMANALIFE, where people can go for more information as well.
Okay.
But to go on with the question, you said, well, what about minerals? What about electrolytes? Well, fulvic acids are nature's electrolyte. And electrolytes are not just minerals. They are compounds, as best way I can say it, from a chemical perspective, that contain structures that donate protons and donate electrons. So this chemical system that's running inside of us is moving electrons and it's moving protons. And an organic battery actually runs without minerals. That being said, it's the fulvic acids, which nature gave us 2.4 billion years ago, that are the interface between nutrients in the soil, amino acids, amino sugars, and nutrient minerals that are taken up by the fulvic substances and put into the plant. And the plant then utilizes these fulvic substances in a similar but not exact way. And then those fulvic acids are translated or transported into the human cell when we eat the food. The problem is that organic agriculture, and I should say commercial agriculture and organic agriculture, for most of the time, unless it's completely regenerative and the cows are out in the field donating organic matter, agricultural practices today are not putting fulvic substances back in the soil. And without fulvic substances in the soil, there's no life. And it's fulvic substances that are depleted in the food chain, not the minerals. Minerals are plentiful in the soil. It's just that the fulvic substances that bring the minerals into the plant or then into the animal that eats the plant are depleted. That's the problem. If we look at what's actually functional in the human cell, 99% of the molecules in the human body are water molecules. There are 500 more molecules of water than there are ion mineral elements in the body. And the minerals make up about 0.85% of the weight of the human body. Minerals are important, yes, but in very small amounts, and ultimately they're recycled in a system that is fully replenished with fulvic substances. Without fulvic substances, there isn't life. And numerous cultures have had to find a different place to live because the soil was overworked and the fulvic substances were lost and they could no longer grow crops. So in ancient cultures, for instance, the ones that were able to keep going higher and higher in the mountains to where they found the fulvic substances in the water and not in the soil. So it's fulvic substances that give us life. And there's a difference between fulvic substances that are given for the minerals and fulvic substances that are given because they are fulvic substances that contain minerals. This is a little hard to explain, but most of the time, like the biofulvic product that you mentioned, or
Okay.
there are other products on the market that are made by taking sodium hydroxide, which is a lye, and adding a lye, which chemically causes something called humans to drop out, the black tarry substances. But you're still left with a solution now of mineral salts at a very high pH because sodium hydroxide is a pH of 13. In order to bring the pH down, then hydrochloric acid is added to bring the pH down, usually in the 8 to 9 range, but we're still left with these products being mineral salts. And this is not what the human body needs. It needs fulvic acids at an acid pH. The fulvic acids are the polyphenols, the fulvic acids are the tannins, The fulvic acids are the CoQ10, the ubiquinone. The fulvic acids are the urolithin A's. The fulvic acids are the precursors for vitamin E and vitamin K, and they're the methyl groups that become the amino acids in the body. It's the fulvic acids that are the 800 different functional compounds that are the building blocks for all those things that I mentioned. And when we're looking to get polyphenols from coffee or from tea or olive oil, flavonoids, fulvic substances are the flavonoids. When we're looking to get flavonoids from blueberries and strawberries and etc., we're having to process foods to get to these things because coffee and tea and strawberries and blueberries and cherries and grapes and whatever, those polyphenols have to be released by burning the food. And when you burn food, you're creating inflammation. So it doesn't make sense to me why create more inflammation to get polyphenols when you get it from fulvic substances, which they're not food. It's organic structures that were given to us by nature 2.4 billion years ago that don't require generating any heat to release them because they're released by the pH chemistry in the body. So, yeah, we're doing things, I think, that don't account for this connection that we have to the nature of who we are. And at the same time, then we're creating more inflammation in our body because processing all these things, whatever we put, whether it's on our skin, in our mouth, in an IV, these things have to be processed and they generate heat. Inflammation is created. And when you go down to the foundation, which is what I call my medical practice, foundational medicine, getting to the root of how we work, generate power with water that has power and replace what we need fundamentally with fulvic substances, and then the body works the way it's designed to be a very efficient pharmacy, a very efficient rebuilder of new cells, a very efficient waste disposal system without the added work of processing more food, creating more heat, creating more waste that needs to be dealt with. Because when you can get to that point of foundational support, the body needs less and less food. I tell my patients all the time. I mean, if we didn't have to eat, we wouldn't die. We're just relegated to the fact that we are organic matter, burning organic food, generating heat, dries us out, and leads to our death. Perhaps in another life or, in an evolved life, we'll be functioning somewhere else, but we're not doing that right now. We're relegated to we can't make our food like plants do. So we're relegated to taking food in and processing it. And we see the things that make food have lived the longest on this planet. Human beings live about 75 years. Plants have been on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years. That's because they make their own food and they're more efficient. Human beings have to use food that they take in, and that generates work, it generates heat, and it ultimately is the process that dries us out and destroys us. So that's what I see as a foundational medicine practitioner. If we get the foundation in place, then our body has less and less food that it needs to process because becomes more efficient in recycling what's already there. Minerals become less and less necessary because the body recycles these minerals. It uses fulvic acid in the processing, but when old cells die, there's something in the cell called the lysosome. The lysosome takes in non-functioning parts, breaks it apart, and then releases it again as pieces to be put back together again. So if we support the healthy recycling system, and some people have heard the word autophagy, I'm certain, but what is that? It's the lysosomal organs in our cells that take in what needs to be removed, the garbage, and then break it down and release it back into the cell to go back into the cycle to make new cells, have them work, and then get rid of the trash. I see it as, as efficiency in the system.
So
That's
how do
what
you
produces longevity, and that's what produces functional health, functional longevity.
so how do you recommend clients of yours then to eat? Like, what obviously less calories, it sounds like, with the assistance of, the fulvic acid and vortex
Right.
water and these things that help create energy. But what do you recommend around
So I
diet?
recommend that people start with understanding a, um, a basic biochemistry of food. So we know from biochemistry that there are three holes that have to be met to sustain and support this whole process. There's a carbohydrate hole, there's a protein hole, and there's a fat hole. We have to have carbohydrates, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We have to have protein, which is nitrogen and hydrogen, and we have to have fat, which is dehydrated carbohydrates. That's what fat is. It's dehydrated. So it's carbon and hydrogen without the water. We have to have these three elements to fuel our needs. But in order to be efficient, we have to understand that these holes have to be filled in such a way that takes into account how they're processed in the body. And that's through something called a glycemic index. So the carbohydrates that we eat, whatever carbohydrate calories is in the food that we're eating, are digested and processed and put onto what I call the bloodstream highway within the first couple of hours. The protein that we eat, the fish, the chicken, the tofu, beef, the turkey, et cetera, the protein that we eat takes about 2 to 4 hours to deliver those calories into the blood, either as structural proteins or as glucose, because protein itself will be converted to glucose if it's necessary. Then the fat we eat goes through a more circuitous process and has to be emulsified by the bile salts, and then through a highly energetic process in the intestinal epithelial cell is turned into something called chylomicrons and delivered to the liver in 4 to 6 hours. So if we are overloading any one of those holes, too many carbohydrates, too much protein, too much fat, then we have overloaded the system. There is an excess in the system. So I I teach my patients biochemical eating to sustain and support what I call interstate highway traffic. Otherwise, the system is either being flooded or it's being droughted with fuel. Because not only do we have the ability of the food we eat, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fat to, to support our needs for glucose, but we also have warehouses in our body that are doing the same thing. So we have stored carbohydrates in our liver called glycogen, or stored carbohydrates in our muscle, which is glycogen, but reserved only for muscle activity. So it's only when we're moving or doing something with our muscles is the glycogen in the muscle going to be used. But the carbohydrate source that we store is glycogen. The protein that we store is either protein in our muscles or structural elements in the cells themselves. And our fat is then either stored as body fat or stored as well in small amounts within the cell itself. And not only do we have these holes that have to be filled to maintain euglycemia, but we also have a need for essential sugars. And there's a science called glycobiology, and there's 11 essential sugars that our body has to have: mannose, xylose, fucose, sialic acid, neurominic acid, glucosamine, and I'm losing the fucose, and I've lost a couple other. But there are specific nutrient sugars beyond the carbohydrates creating glucose. There are nutrient sugars that we have to get that are going to be incorporated into our cells that are being used as signaling messages within the cell itself. The protein that we take in is being made into structure of our muscles, certainly, but also the structures within the cells ourselves that are supporting the actions of our cells and supporting the movement of things between cells and supporting the messaging system. That's the best way I can say it. And then we have to have a specific type of fatty acid called omega-3 and which are required to make eicosanoids in our body. And this is something I learned going back to the zone, that the cell to cell communication system that happens is generated by using polyunsaturated fats, omega-3 and omega-6 fats. And these are turned into things called prostaglandins, thromboxanes, interleukins. And if we don't have polyunsaturated fats being delivered into our cells can't communicate with each other. So to me, this isn't about diets, because a diet is a way to try to maintain weight, but learning the basic biochemistry of how food works is about maintaining cellular function. And talking about high fat, low fat, high carb, no carb, high protein, no protein. I mean, what does that even mean? People don't even know what that means. So how do you know how much protein you need? How many people even know how to do that? So I teach people how much protein do you need every day to fill your protein hole. And the protein you need is based on your lean body weight. Everyone that comes into my practice gets a body composition test where I look at body fat, I look at lean body weight, also tells me about total body water. And I find out how active they are, and that determines how much protein they need. And then once I know how much protein they need, then that determines how much carbohydrate they need. Because a totally balanced diet biochemically is equal calories from protein and carbohydrate and fat every time a person eats. And then the fat is determined by how much protein. And based on the fact that carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram, protein is 4 calories per gram, and fat is 9 calories per gram, then there has to be some calculation, yes, to determine how you balance protein, carbohydrate, and fat calories. But teaching somebody a diet doesn't really teach them how to take care of their body, because people then either underload or overload, and they're on this roller coaster of too much fuel or not enough fuel. And what happens if there's too much fuel coming into the intestinal tract to be processed? There's a fundamental principle of enzyme function, that enzymes function based on substrate concentration. That means how much are they being presented with? Too much substrate shuts them down. And what happens if there's too much protein or too much carbohydrate or too much fat delivered to the intestinal system? Then that food is going to be fermented by the bacteria that are in the intestinal tract. And if there's too much food being presented in the small intestine, there will be a migration of the the colonic bacteria into the small intestinal tract. And what do you get? SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And that's coming from the fact that the body can't process what it's been delivered on its own. And the bacteria are going to be enlisted to ferment the food. And what does fermentation create? Acids: lactic acid, glutamic acid, phytic acid, acetic acid, etc. And these acids are now delivered into the system, into the blood that's functioning at an alkaline pH. And what does this do to the power that's in the blood? It goes down, and that's where disease starts. Once the power is lost because the rules have been broken, because there's an excess of anything, then that's where power is lost. And the problem is that power takes years, that loss in power takes years and years to come to the surface, as a heart attack, as gallstones, as rheumatoid arthritis, as cognitive behavioral issues, as SIBO, or as leaky gut. What is leaky gut? when you have more acids in the intestinal tract, then the power to these gates, to these fences, the opening and closing of the tight junctions in the intestinal cell are controlled by the electricity within the cell itself. And when you lose power, what happens to the ability to close the gates or even open them? They stop. And that's where you get a free flow of of large molecules that aren't supposed to be there because the fundamental rule has been broken, that there's an overload or an underload and power can't be maintained within the intestinal epithelial cell. And food has to be presented to that intestinal epithelial cell at a pH of about 7, which is neutral. The cell itself works at a pH of about 6.5. So if you're eating food that's highly acidic and your pancreas has a limited capacity to secrete amylase and lipase, which is more alkaline, then you've delivered food into your intestines that's too acidic and your intestinal cells can't work. That's the next rule of enzyme function, is that enzymes are very sensitive to pH. They work within a very narrow range of pH. And if you have blood that's a pH of 7, it's compromising the enzymes in the blood that's supposed to be a pH of 7.4. If you have blood in your brain that's a pH of 6.7 or 6.8, it's not compatible with life. So for me, starting from the foundation, knowing that we need water that has power, we need fulvic substances that support the movement of electricity in the protons being donated, the protons being received, the electrons being donated, the electrons being received. And then the next step is to control enzyme function and treat the enzymes as if they were extremely valuable, which they are. And that's not overloading them, not delivering to them things that are either too high in acid or too low in acid that doesn't make them work. And then supporting the system with electricity. If we don't follow the rules, then our system can't function. And this is what I learned beyond functional medicine, that there are rules. It isn't magic, that there really are no superfoods. The magic is in the system that's working the way it's designed, but it has to be nurtured in such a way that the conditions are set up so that it can work in the way it's designed. Does that make sense?
It does. Could you give, like, I would love to hear, how are you testing for this? What are you looking at maybe on lab work to recognize that this is really working for an individual, which way they maybe need to go, one or the other in terms of adjusting their pH? And then the other thing would be like, maybe just like, hey, here's a sample day of like how I eat, how I structure my meals to be balanced, but also diversify my food to maintain this balance and also to support the microbiome as well.
So basically, the first thing is to get the balance of foods correct. That's how a person has to understand. What is protein, what is carbohydrate, what is fat, and then when the fulvic acids are included, they are probiotic, prebiotic, and postbiotic. The most important part of the microbiome is actually the mycobiome, the healthy fungi that we have in our intestinal tract. It's the fungi in our intestinal tract that are able to produce fulvic acids under anaerobic conditions. The bacteria that we have in our gut are functioning under, sorry, I got that wrong. It's the fungi that are producing the fulvic substances under aerobic conditions. The anaerobes, the lactobacillus and bifidobacter, can only produce parts of organic substances under anaerobic conditions. And so when a person is supplementing with fulvic substances, they're getting prebiotic, they're getting postbiotic, they're getting probiotic because it's the waste product of fungal metabolism that's supporting the forward feedback loop for healthy bacteria and healthy fungi to grow in the first place. So not only are the fulvic substances polyphenols and tannins and the most powerful antioxidants we know, and ubiquinone and CoQ10 and vitamin E and vitamin K and the precursor methyl groups for amino acids. They're also probiotic, prebiotic, and postbiotic. So, the things that I start with all my patients is Vortex water and fulvic substances. And then when I measure, I'm looking at fundamental cell processes. So I look at iron binding capacity, I look at cholesterol, I look at triglycerides, I look at insulin levels, I look at fasting blood sugar, I look at hemoglobin A1C, which is a very important part of evaluating what I call enzyme status. I look at thyroid function, I look at TSH, I look at free T4, free T3, I look at thyroid antibodies, I look at cortisol levels, I do cortisol testing in saliva, in urine, in blood. I mean, it just depends on the circumstances. I do vitamin D testing, and then I certainly can do more involved testing.
Sure.
But I start with those basic things. And then when I'm looking at the system, I look at all of those things together as a system. So those numbers for me are putting that person's system on the map.
Mhm.
And as an example, thyroid function is involved in taking nutrients in, taking food in, breaking it apart, and then and supporting the signaling messages in the body that are making the machinery work to do things. I call thyroid system the rheostat in the cells. It's dialing in how fast or how slow the conveyor belts can move. And if we look at thyroid function as an example, thyroid antibodies increase in the blood when cells are dying. Thyroid cells are dying faster than they get replaced. When a cell dies, it literally explodes. And when that cell has exploded, there's what I call shrapnel in the blood. There's all sorts of protein fragments, there's mineral fragments, there's fatty acid fragments. And what the system is doing, the immune system or the trash disposal system, it's recognizing that garbage as something that's not supposed to be there. And an antigen antibody reaction, it bags the trash. So, thyroid dysfunction, Hashimoto's, elevation of antibodies is actually a sign that there's excess breakdown in the system and not enough growth. And it's part of the process that I'm talking about. So there are rules being broken that aren't allowing the process of taking nutrients in for the cells to function properly and to get rid of their own waste. And so the waste accumulates as antibodies, not just thyroid antibodies, but what are the gluten and gliadin antibodies that are measured in the blood as well.
Mhm.
So if the system isn't able to fully break down the gluten that comes in, and it then becomes antigenic garbage. The body is designed to survive. It's survived to live. It's not designed to kill itself, but it can be overloaded, and that's an important message I want to give people. That if we are overloading the system, it just cannot work. It's going to break down. And that's why it's if a person really wants to be healthy, it's about finding that place where there's balance and not excess. And by the same token, not drought. So when I talk about calorie restriction, I'm not talking about fasting. I'm talking about reducing the number of calories that are eaten with any meal. Most people just eat too much. They're burning too many calories. And that burning is the spark that's lighting the fire of inflammation and disease.
Yeah. I mean, we see it a lot we work with a lot of chronic gut issues, a lot of autoimmune cases. And there's also this messaging out in the world of you females don't eat enough and you need a reverse diet, up a ton of calories. And when we're working these cases, the more these people eat, the worse they feel. And so absolutely makes sense when you're not absorbing, when you're not digesting, eh, when you're overall dysfunctional. Uh, you will just create more oxidative stress within the body. And especially what we find too is as people chronically undereat, the opposite, and metabolic function slows down and you try to eat, blood sugars stay elevated even with less calories because your body cannot process the food adequately. And so then We keep blood sugars higher, we keep inflammation constantly in the blood. And so we, from a chemical standpoint, completely get where you are coming from. I mean, you've broken down more of the science and the chemical aspect of what we talk
Right.
about all the time in terms of it's not about more calories to fix someone's metabolic health, someone's overall health. It is about how the body's able to utilize those calories and the balance of calories ultimately that come in.
Correct, because just as there are holes that I said that are filled with what the food you're eating, um, the body is going to actually cannibalize itself if food isn't coming in, and that's also inflammatory. So if there isn't a steady blood sugar coming in the first 2 hours, the body's going to go to glycogen, it's stored carbohydrate. 2 to 4 hours after that, it's going to start breaking down its own muscle through something called a gluconeogenic process. It's going to break down its own muscle to survive. It's not until about 4 to 6 hours later that any fat is starting to be burned. So that's another thing that I see isn't fully realized is that unless there is attention paid to this process, then there's there's either overload in proteins or carbohydrates or fats coming in, or there's an underload that's forcing the body to cannibalize itself and break itself down and go into what's called deconstruction, and that's inflammatory, and that's negative as well. So we know that we need to have a certain minimal amount of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats coming in to support something called this biomass. It's called biomass regeneration of muscles, regeneration of bone, regeneration of liver cells, regeneration of brain cells. We know we need to have limited amounts of nutrient elements coming in on a regular basis. Otherwise, our body is going to go to the stored places to break those things down. And that in and of itself is inflammatory. So, what I see, it's about balance. It's about balance in everything. And balance in more than just food. Excess TV time, excess screen time, excesses in exercise, excesses in exposures to sights and sounds. I mean, there's no more places for excess than just food, because if the brain is processing these things, all these things, what's happening? If you could look at the brain in doing this work, it's literally on fire. So, what is all this excess doing to the brain? It's drying it out. And what is Alzheimer's disease or cognitive behavioral issues? It's dryness of the brain. As a surgeon, I'm not a neurosurgeon, so I never felt, Alzheimer's brain, but I felt the plaque. I felt cancer. I felt rheumatoid nodules and operated on them. It's hard. It's hard as a rock. Disease is dryness. It's hardness. There's no judgment about how anyone is living their life, but my point is that if a person wants to live their life well, then they have to figure out a way to find the balance in everything, and it can start with food. It can start with some fundamental principles of giving your body what it needs, which is water that has power and fulvic acids. And when that happens, you take the workload off the body. You stop the excess that your body's having to process. And based on my own personal experience and that of my patients, then there's more calmness in the brain. There isn't so much stuff, random chaotic thoughts moving through the brain on a regular basis and even accessing different information. Yeah, but that's a different discussion for a different day. But everything about who we are, what we think, what we access, how we feel is controlled by power, by energy, and how power can continue to be delivered to the system without breaking it down. I mean, that's what biohacking to me is all about,
Yeah.
is
Using your body's design abilities.
protecting the cells to deliver what it needs in the time that it needs it in a way that doesn't drain it from working.
Yeah.
From draining it from its capacity to do the work.
Yeah. So, last question, just because we like to give some really tactical and applicable things. You obviously have mentioned several things in here, right? We always going to look at lab work. We're going to look at, energizing our water or bringing power to the water and using the fulvic acid. But I know in the conventional space, I was just chatting with a client yesterday. I did some lab analysis for her husband and I said, "Hey, how's he doing? Just want to check in because I haven't heard anything." She said, "Oh man, he went to the doctor and he just totally downplayed like many of the things that you had to say." Because I'm like, he is type 2 diabetic. We are here. You're at a 5.7, 5.8. I don't recall exactly what it was. And because it's been in the conventional range, they're not concerned. It's like, I'm going to wait for you to be fully diseased before I'm going to do anything about this. So, we always talk about less than 5.4, but I really like to see around 5.2 for that A1C. And our audience should know this 3-month average of your blood glucose, as we've been talking about here, and also the importance of getting fasting insulin to look at that as well, because that will rise before A1C does and so forth. But from your perspective, tell us, when you are counseling a client and you're looking at these labs, where do you want to see them optimally?
Where do I want to see the lab? The one specifically that you talked about, or?
Fasting insulin, or you really A1C was my question here because I think that's a more common one
Yeah,
people can.
I like to see A1C somewhere in that range, 5.2 to 5.4. And I
Okay.
also explain it to this way, which traditional quote unquote medicine doesn't see. So if I see an A1C that starts at 5.1 and it goes to 5.3 and then it goes to 5.6, then it goes to 5.8,
Mhm.
that patient is diabetic. It doesn't matter to me that they haven't reached that limit of 6.5, which is the lab where you get the lab diagnosis, because the diabetes is building from the time that that person moved from 5.2 to 5.3 to 5.4, 5.6. There was diabetes there from the beginning. And
Okay.
that's where the intervention has to happen. Because by the time you have type 2 diabetes that requires some sort of medicine or other allopathic intervention, including insulin, that's not a treatment for the root cause of the disease. It's only treating a symptom and functionally suppressing the disease even further so that it's going to progress into other things. The type 2 diabetes leading to kidney failure, leading to macular degeneration, leading to cognitive behavioral abnormalities, leading to Alzheimer's disease. That diagnosis of diabetes with an A1C of 6.5 is actually too late,
Right.
because it's getting back to my analogy. Once that brick becomes hard, how easy is it to turn it back into mud? I don't know how many patients that I have begging me. My father's 84, 85, 86. My mother has Alzheimer's disease. Do something. What can we do? And at that point, the only thing that can be done is work on the part of the brain that's still alive. And that's the excitatory inflammatory function. And it can only be affected by modulating some of those inflammatory, excitatory responses, or giving a drug which completely extinguishes those symptoms, which ends up being some sort of antipsychotic medication. And,
Yeah.
and, and the problem in my practice is that because of the way that information gets to people through either their traditional medical doctor or through the news or through YouTube or whatever it is, this process that I'm talking about isn't understood. And the treatment for Alzheimer's has to start way before 80 years of age. It has to start at 26, when the
Yep.
body actually starts to lose its capacity to translate light into energy. And it's really hard in a milieu where it's, well, this person looks great, but they have colon cancer. This person looks great, but they just fell over from a heart attack. They exercise on a regular basis and they eat well. Well, it's cognitive dissonance. How can that possibly be that this person who's 26 with colon cancer is healthy? So
And I
it's the messages that people are getting. And so, my message is that we've got to start now. We can't wait till the disease actually shows and tips above the ocean as the iceberg at the top of the ocean. We have to go down as the iceberg is starting and change the conditions that are making that iceberg be created in the first place. And
yeah.
that's what I've been talking about now. The conditions that are set, that are making the iceberg. What is the iceberg? It's excess. The conditions that make disease are excess, and it has to be stopped now. And it is science. It does involve science, but for me, yes, I can talk the science words, but I also it breaks down to simple. Drink water that has been energized, that has life back in it. Take fulvic substances and find a way to moderate the food that you're eating so that you're not getting an excess of any one of the nutrient groups. It
Yeah.
can be very simple.
Yeah. I think it's hard in a world where, like we were saying earlier, I mean, diet culture, like you mentioned, people think diet is just how to lose weight, right? And then you have all of the different variations out there that are very confusing and conflicting and dogmatic, right? In terms of carbs are the best thing ever. And then you got the next guy, carbs are the worst thing ever. Same with
Carnivore,
fat,
keto.
same with protein. And it just creates such confusion that I think people
Right.
just also say, forget it, right? This is too much work and effort when they don't understand and they're stressed about a million other things. So, we agree with the balance. I think diversity is really important, though, too, just as we kind of talked about in terms of making sure that we aren't eating the same things all the time. We're getting the best of both worlds. We're getting those pre, pro, and postbiotic supports. So very good. If you would just let our listeners know, like, where they can go and find you, listen to more of your education, where they can find the fulvic acid that you're talking about, as well as the way to bring power back to the water, that would be great. And we can put all that in the show notes as well.
Excellent. Thank you. For more about me and my understanding, I direct people to my own website, which is wanekmedical.com. It's WANEKMEDICAL.com. So that goes into greater detail about things that I've talked about. To get more specifics about vortex water and fulvic acids, then I invite people to go to liveamanalife.com, liveamanalife.com. And that's basically showing people or explaining to people how to apply the fundamental principles and incorporate fundamental biologic, electrical, and biochemical principles into your life for optimal function.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise. And just as always, for those listening, make sure that you go and follow her, check her out, and share this episode with somebody who maybe needs to hear this education and be reminded that the foundations really do matter.